Joining us now, we have Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and Substacker extraordinaire, friend of the show, Glenn Greenwald. Great to see you, Glenn.
Good to see you, Glenn.
You guys, thanks for inviting me.
Of course. Saagar actually just delivered a monologue about the Durham indictment of this Democratic lawyer Sussman over at Perkins Coie. Just explain to the audience what you think is so significant about this.
I think there are two aspects to it. One is the fact that this is not a Republican Justice Department, but a Justice Department supervised by Joe Biden's Attorney General Merrick Garland, who approved of this indictment, specifically and explicitly stating that the Trump Alpha Bank story that the media spread so aggressively in the middle of 2016 and even beyond is a fraud, that the FBI concluded very early on that there was no evidence to suggest this was some kind of nefarious or clandestine connection. And yet you have the reporters responsible for having spread it, like Franklin Fuller and Natasha Bertrand and Rachel Maddow and Chris Hayes, who not only have thrived in the wake of doing that, but also who haven't bothered at all to even address this indictment. Rachel Maddow did one segment about it before the indictment even came out, when nobody knew what it said, where she kind of maligned the indictment and dismissed it as insignificant. But the parts of it that debunk their reporting is something that they've just completely ignored. They haven't even acknowledged that the story they pushed, according to the Biden administration, is completely false. But I think the much more important part of the story is the window it provides into how Clinton operatives worked hand in hand with friendly media outlets. It was, according to the indictment, this Clinton lawyer, Michael Sussman, who worked with these researchers and was told by them that the data wasn't good enough to disseminate the story, and yet he did it anyway. He fed it to Frank Foer at Slate, who's now at The Atlantic. And then Hillary Clinton is the one who elevated it by pretending that she learned about it for the first time in Slate, when in fact it was her lawyers working with Fusion GPS, who worked for Hillary Clinton, who contracted Christopher Steele, responsible for concocting the whole story. And the worst part might be that we learned for the first time that Franklin Foer took his marching orders from Fusion GPS. They were the one who said, okay, Frank, it's time to get moving, like kind of snapping their fingers. And then not only did he obey, but he sent them the draft of his story to get approval from the Clinton operatives who were manufacturing and engineering the entire thing. So you get a view into how this journalistic corruption drove the scammier parts of Russiagate for so long.
Yeah, it's completely insane when you look at the details. And Glenn, as you point out, the indictments so far in terms of what we've been revealed, both on Sussman, on the Carter Page FISA warrant as well, reveal actually, frankly, in our view, like more corruption on that view, or on the origins of the investigation, than really in what they built up as this grand conspiracy. Can you speak to the Carter Page situation as well?
Yeah, so this is the second. Technically, the FBI lawyer who pled guilty in January wasn't indicted. It wasn't necessary because he pled guilty, but he pled guilty to a very serious crime, which was, as you may recall, in 2016, after Carter Page had worked with the Trump campaign, the FBI convinced the FISA court to issue warrants to allow them to spy in the most invasive way possible on this American citizen, Carter Page, by claiming there was evidence to believe he was an agent of the Russian government. They read his emails, they listened to his phone calls pursuant to these warrants. And as it turned out, according to Robert Mueller, there was no evidence to establish that Carter Page was ever an agent of the Russian government. And beyond that, the FBI altered documents and lied to the FISA court in order to get it. So as you say, Saagar, the most important thing here, in my view, is that there were indictments, obviously, on the other side of the equation from Robert Mueller, but almost all of those were crimes committed during the investigation. The accusation that spawned the investigation was that American citizens had criminally conspired with Russia to interfere in the 2016 election. And the grand total of Americans indicted for that crime, the one that started all of Russiagate, that spawned Mueller, is zero. So I think what you're seeing is that the real criminality and the real corruption was not on the side of those who supposedly conspired with Russia, because Mueller said he couldn't find evidence to establish that conspiracy. It was on the side of those who in secret propagated this conspiracy theory and drowned our politics in it for the next 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
And Glenn, I think it's really important to drill down on this media piece that you highlighted that was so revealing with Frank Foer, who's effectively, through Fusion GPS, taking his marching orders directly from the Hillary Clinton campaign. And by the way, this is not like only Democrats do this. This is routinely how what is now effectively partisan media operates. Can you lay out for people what are the incentives for quote unquote journalists to operate in this sort of manner as effectively stenographers either of politicians, political campaigns, or deep state actors?
Well, I mean, look, on the one hand, it is true that as a journalist, you need to get your information from somewhere. And oftentimes you need to rely on sources who have kind of shady or partisan or less than benevolent motives. And that might even be partisan operatives. Sometimes people doing partisan research or opposition research for a political party or a candidate actually does obtain information in the public interest and wants to feed it to you as a journalist, even if it's for their own end. It still helps you do reporting. But you have to be very careful that when you're dealing with people like that you don't end up as their pawns, that you can use them as your source and you can get information from them that, you think is necessary to enable your reporting. But what you never want to do is turn into their servants with the hope that they're going to keep feeding you. And that instead of doing your job as a journalist, you end up carrying out their agenda as a partisan operative. And clearly, the Clinton world is extremely experienced. They've dominated liberal politics for, 2 or 3 decades, from the early 1990s through 2016 when Hillary Clinton ran. That's almost 3 decades. And they're very adept at cultivating these journalists who are very subservient to them because they know there are so many rewards for doing the bidding of the Clintons. And that, combined with the fact that there were just so many true believers who thought their role as journalists wasn't to do reporting, but to feed Donald Trump, completely corrupted the profession in ways that I don't think it's recovered.
It certainly hasn't. One of the things I learned really from you, because I wasn't around at the time, was about how the Atlantic, who is currently being headed by Jeffrey Goldberg, who himself was one of the chief architects of manufacturing consent for the Iraq War, then became one of the hotbeds of Russiagate conspiracism at the highest level, where Natasha Bertrand, who you mentioned, and Franklin Foer both worked at during the height of Russiagate. How can you draw the connection between Iraq and Russiagate? Because it does just go to show how all the mechanisms are still in place.
Yeah, I mean, Matt Taibbi has said that Russiagate is the WMD of our generation from the perspective of media failure. Now, obviously, if you say that, people react and say Russiagate didn't result in the destruction of a country of 26 million people and a war and all of that. So no one's saying the impact was worse or similar. What people are saying when Matt Taibbi says that, and people like me ratify it, is that the same media tactics of corruption, deceit, and propaganda were employed. So just begin with the fact that there's an enormous amount of overlap between the leading Russiagators and those who were the people who were pushing the lies about Saddam Hussein, either that he was searching for nuclear weapons, had weapons of mass destruction, was in an alliance with Al-Qaeda. That's why so many of these Republicans, like the Lincoln Project, the Never Trump people, Bill Krystal, David Frum, who became the leading Russiagators, were also the leaders of the lies about the Iraq War, because the tactics were exactly the same. The propaganda techniques were exactly the same. And the thing that amazes me so much is that if you look at who the worst offenders were for helping the Bush and Cheney administration deceive Americans about Saddam Hussein and leading Americans to war, it was the people who then ended up getting most rewarded. And Jeffrey Goldberg is the best example because he was at the New Yorker, one of the most influential liberal outlets, and published 2 articles in 2002 claiming that Saddam Hussein had WMDs, and more harmfully, that he was in an alliance with Osama bin Laden, who just less than a year earlier had attacked the United States through 9/11. So you can imagine how inflammatory that was. And instead of going off in disgrace and getting fired and shunned from journalistic circles for these profound lies that he told, he got promoted to one of the most powerful and important positions in all of journalism as a reward for his lies, which is being editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, and then used that position to elevate almost every person who led the lies that were in Russiagate. And we're talking about this Trump Alpha Bank story. The two journalists who pushed it most were Franklin Foer and Natasha Bertrand, and both ended up being hired by Jeffrey Goldberg at The Atlantic as a reward for the lies that they told. Obviously, MSNBC and Rachel Maddow, who pushed the Steele dossier, she just got rewarded with a $30 million a year contract. And so what you're seeing is this perverse incentive scheme, both in Iraq and Russiagate, where the journalists who do the most shameless lying on behalf of the security state and the correct political interests of the time are the ones who are rewarded, not despite their lies, but because of them.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that there were a lot of journalists who, sure, the career incentives were good, but they also were true believers. And they really came to see it as, it's my job to help defeat Donald Trump versus just to be a sort of neutral actor here and portray the world as it actually exists. And certainly Donald Trump had some unique personality traits that made him a useful villain. I mean, and he sort of leaned into that, right? He's very useful for the Democratic Party and for these journalists, ultimately to convince people that, you know, he was a unique evil and that effectively any sort of tactics were justified to try to defeat this man both in 2016 and 2020. Do you think that they'll be able to repeat that if Trump doesn't run again, if we have, whether it's Ron DeSantis or maybe it'll be Trump Jr. or who knows, if you have another Republican put in that slot, do you think they'll be as effective at sort of demonizing them and using them in the way that they were able to effectively use Donald Trump, much to their own, you know, ratings and personal, professional success?
They're definitely going to try. I mean, if you look at what the number one priority, the number one media and political project of kind of the Russiagate wing of the media and the political ecosystem is, it's to keep Trumpism alive. That's why they insist on calling what happened on January 6th an insurrection. It's why they've issued multiple Homeland Security warnings throughout this year, claiming that Trump supporters are going to engage in all kinds of violence that never end up coming to fruition. You saw it this weekend where CNN and MSNBC never stopped talking about this rally that not one single MAGA person that I knew had even heard of. You know, they would go to like Jim Jordan. They'd be like, are you going to this Justice for, you know, January 6th defendant rally? And he would be like, what are you talking about? Like, no one knew what it was, but it was the media that had such an interest in propping it up. And of course, 50 people ended up showing up. Probably most of them were like feds and people undercover. And they were wildly outnumbered just by the uniform feds and the number of journalists who were there. So keeping Trumpism alive is incredibly important, both for media ratings, but also to keep fear levels high so that the Democratic Party doesn't have to run on a positive agenda like they didn't do in 2020, but instead just saying, vote for us because we're the only ones standing in the way between you and these scary people. But the question of whether, if you get a kind of more traditionally behaved politician like Josh Hawley or Ron DeSantis or, you know, any of them, whether that they'll be able to do that as much and as effectively as when you have Donald Trump, who's so wildly outside the box comportmentally, is an open question. But it's also an open question. Let's remember, Trump was actually, despite all that, a successful politician. He defeated the Clinton machine in 2016, despite everyone lined up against him. And in 2020, despite the worst possible conditions you can have as an incumbent, a collapsing economy, joblessness crisis, and a pandemic, he almost won in 2020. So the other question is, if you don't have Trump there and you have a less charismatic figure, will they have even more success kind of scaring and demonizing people against voting for them? That remains to be seen.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.